This text that we're going to dive into in our series Encounters is one that's a bit controversial. It's controversial because it is often used against the church and with various agendas. Parts of the text seem to be glossed over or ignored. But today I want to peel back the layers of what will be a familiar passage for many of us, but maybe we'll see it from a little bit of a different perspective. But before that, we're in the Gospels looking at the encounters that Jesus had with people. Life-changing, transformational encounters that made all the difference for somebody's life from that point forward. And I suspect there are some people in this room this morning that know what it's like to have a life-changing encounter with Jesus. Where are you? Where are those folks? Some of us were filthy and soiled by sinful living, and He came and He washed us clean. Anybody in the room there? Some of us were consumed with anger. We were violent in our heart, but He showed up and He soothed our soul. Some of us were poisoned by unforgiveness and bitterness, but He came and He healed our wounded heart. Some of us were spent. We were used up because of promiscuity and toxic relationships, but He came and replenished what had been lost. Some of us were ashamed, we were guilt-stricken, we were heartsick with self-loathing, but Jesus came in and restored our joy and gave us hope and life. Some of us had been hollowed out by addiction. We were a shell, a zombie of a human being, but He filled us with Himself and pushed out everything else that we were trying to fill ourselves with. Some of us made some decisions and we earned some major consequences, but Jesus came in His mercy and He mitigated all the potential of how bad the consequences could have been. I wonder if anybody in Cornerstone knows what it's like to be different because of this Jesus. He takes the filthy and He makes us clean. He takes the broken and puts back together. He takes what's lost and restores. He takes what has been corrupted and He redeems it. That's what He does. He did it over and over and over and over in the Gospels. And today's account is no different. So I want to read the whole text this morning in its entirety, and then I will refer to it as I go through the message. I do want to say this is another encounter Jesus had with a woman, but I don't want the men to get tired of hearing about the encounters with the women, because the story is always about Jesus, the Son of God, at the center, demonstrating what God's culture looks like, expressing how God handles people, and for all of the men in the room, showing what true masculinity looks like, what true strength looks like. So here's John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning He was back at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and He sat down and He taught them. As He was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught, say caught, in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? They were trying to trap Him into saying something they could use against Him, but Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with His finger. They kept demanding an answer, so He stood up again and said, all right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. Then He stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. Jesus, we ask that your presence would begin to move in this room. As we talk about you, may your kingdom come and your will be done. I pray that today you would break the back of shame and guilt. I also pray today that you would give us strength and that our hearts would be fortified in this hour. Lord, I pray that today the voice of the accuser would be silenced. And I pray that today you'd be glorified. Amen. So I want to work my way through the text, and it's important to start with the situation the woman finds herself in. The text says that she has been caught in adultery. She has been caught. She was not falsely accused. This was not a matter of gossip or slander. This wasn't mere rumor mill fodder. This was a scenario where she had been caught in the act. There was no speculation about her morals. This was not a he said, she said type of situation. She had sinned. She was in the wrong. She had messed up. And it's important to know that and to see that and to identify it and not shy away from it. She had been caught in the act. We don't know what part of participation. She might have had a husband that she was unfaithful to. She might have simply been the other woman, but she was complicit. She was wrong. And I say it's important to state this because oftentimes when people allude to this text, it seems that that fact gets overlooked. It seems that this woman's sin, her wrong, gets glossed over so that we can point at other people that we deem nefarious in the account. But the whole account starts with a human, a woman who had violated the law of God, who had stepped out of alignment with God's best for her. She was in sin. Now, we get to looking at her, and she's often painted as a sympathetic figure, and she is a sympathetic figure, but not in the sense that she is in some way been falsely accused. She is a sympathetic figure in the sense that, sister, what are you doing? How did you get to this place? How did you find yourself making these decisions? And I'm curious in this room if anybody has ever been caught. I got caught one time. I was in first grade. And I was in the beginning of class, and we had an assignment every day in first grade. We had to write from 1 to 100 before the bell rang. And I had been fraternizing with some of my fellow classmates, laughing and joking, and it just so happened that the bell rang and I was not at 100. I panicked. I was the type of kid that did not want to do wrong. I did not want to get in trouble. But oftentimes your desire to not do wrong can compound into doing wrong, right? So I had a cast on at the time because I had broken my arm a few weeks earlier. And I was in the class, and I had an easy problem that I could have brought to the attention of the teacher. But instead I went to my teacher afraid that I would be in trouble for not getting to 100 and said, I'm feeling sick. She looked at me and said, okay, go to the office. I go to the office, and they allow me to call my mother. Now, I could have told them my arm was hurting. That would have been logical, but I was first grade. I wasn't good at lying. I feel sick. So they call my mom. My mom pulls up to the school. I vividly remember getting in the car. Mom looked at me and said, you ain't sick. Caught. I'm talking caught. I panicked. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. Mom knows everything, and she takes me home, and unfortunately, it was a day when my dad wasn't at work. And my dad had a high value on my education. Even in first grade, if I made C's in writing because my handwriting was terrible. And one time I made a C in writing, and I was not allowed to touch my toys for a week. Consequences. So some of you are like, oh, what? How brutal. I still can't write. So my dad says, all right, you're going to lie and skip school. We had a stack of wood that was just piled, and he wanted me to make it an organized stack. So with a broke arm in a cast, I spent the rest of the day carrying one piece of wood at a time and stack consequences when you get caught. I wonder if anybody has ever been caught. Has your sin ever caught up with you? Have you ever done wrong and paid a price? Have you ever given in to passions? Have you ever surrendered to pressure? Have you ever schemed and devised? And as a result, people suddenly find out. I don't know if you've ever been caught, but the body has an interesting response to being caught. Your heart starts beating so hard that it feels like it's going to pound out of your chest. You begin to feel a tingling sensation over your entire physical body, like 10,000 needles just poking every part of you. What do I do? How do I handle this? Your mouth gets dry. You can't spit out a single word. You're confused. Some of you know what it's like to be caught, and then suddenly it feels like you're having an out-of-body experience. Is this my life? Is this really happening right now? People that get caught seem instantly to turn from prideful and cocky and arrogant to beggars. Oh, please don't punish me. Please don't convict me. This will ruin my life. This will ruin my marriage. This will ruin my kids. It will ruin my money. Every bit of energy zapped from you. You don't know whether to be angry or to be heartbroken. I wonder if anybody in the room, you don't have to signify by a raised hand, but anybody that knows what it's like to be caught. Can you imagine what this woman felt in this moment? Caught. She can't deny it. She can't make an excuse. She can't gloss over it. She has been caught in sin, and there's a great consequence. And sin has consequences. It will compound your problems. It'll cost you something. It'll bring you into a place of isolation and shame. It'll cause you to ache with guilt. And I wonder if anybody's ever been caught and other people know you've been caught. Here she is brought in the middle of a crowd, surrounded by eyes that are now witnessing her greatest failure. Have you ever been caught and had to blush with embarrassment? Have you ever had your sin whispered on the lips of the crowd? Have you ever gone into a family engagement and have them shake their heads because they know what you did? Have you ever come to church knowing you messed up and other people know that you messed up? I can't imagine fully what it was like for this woman. I just know that she sinned. There were consequences. She was caught. And I want to be clear as we work our way through this text that at Cornerstone Church, we call a spade a spade. Sin is sin. In society, there is a great discomfort with calling things sin. As a matter of fact, they try to rebrand, recategorize, rename any and everything. We'll make it an issue. But sin is sin, whether it's lying or manipulating or it's stealing or it's violence or it's pornography or it's abortion or it's slander and gossip and drunkenness or it's homosexuality or greed or pride. Sin has consequence. Are you enjoying this encouraging message? I have a tension in preaching. I had this conversation with our daughter a few weeks ago on the way home from church. I have a tension in preaching. Number one, I have a conviction that right is right and wrong is wrong. And I have this compulsion of the Holy Spirit to make sure that all of those things are clearly communicated. And I have a deep desire to see no one suffer the consequences of sin. I don't want any of us in the room to get in error and as a result have to deal with the fallout. And so there is this tenacity in me that says I never want to be gray on the fact that there are things that violate the heart of God and there are repercussions for that violation. But as much as I have conviction, I have compassion too. And I've learned from 45 years of living that oftentimes there is a reason why a decision was made. There is a path that led to sin. There are a series of happenings. There is some personal history that brought a person to the point of bad decision making. And so I stand in front of you today, and I hope that you hear me. I desperately call us as a people to holiness. But simultaneously, I desperately want you to know that we grieve with anybody who is caught. We weep with anybody who is caught. We hurt with anybody who is caught. And we need to do the work to figure out how they got to that place to bring healing. So my tension is I want to honor the Lord by calling us to holiness and righteousness, but I equally want to honor the Lord by operating in compassion and mercy. And so the woman sinned, but she wasn't the only one on the scene, right? We had a crowd. Now there were two groups in the crowd. The first crowd that was gathered, they were sitting and listening to Jesus talk. They were genuine seekers. We don't know their varying degrees of acceptance of who Jesus was or what he was saying, but they showed up that day willingly to listen to the Master teach. Some of them maybe were already sold out, bought in, devoted followers that were committed to a life of discipleship. Others were curious. Some of them had just heard of the tales of miracles and said, I want to know more. There was a group that were genuine seekers, and I have an affinity for the genuine seeker. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be able to fill in all the blanks. If you're just somebody that will show up and say, I want to hear from this Jesus, I can get a lot done with some seekers. And I would just submit to you, being a seeker is way more important than being perfect. Being a seeker is way more important than having it all together. You could still be a little mixed up. You could still be very much in process. You could still have some issues you're working through. But if you will show up as a seeker and say, I want to hear from this Jesus. I want to be in proximity to this Jesus. I have found if we can live there, you'll be all right in the end. So that's one group, but there's another group that shows up onto the scene, dragging this woman behind them, the Pharisees, the religious teachers, the elders of the community. And that second group had an agenda. They had an agenda, they had an objective. They were trying to, as the text tells us, trap Jesus into saying something they could use against him. The woman was just a pawn in their game. The account really isn't about the woman. The account is all about Jesus. She was just a pawn. And they were upset with him. We learned in the previous chapter that they were very angry with Jesus. He had created a great deal of frustration and tension for them. And that's because Jesus creates tension. I want to say this to the seasoned saint as well as to the person who is far from the Lord. Jesus creates tension for all of us. Jesus' love and mercy shames every cold, rigid, detached organization that's in the earth. And it shames all the rigidity in us. Jesus' generosity, his poverty, the fact that he said the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, it shames the greedy, and it shames anything in us that isn't generous. Jesus' holiness, his purity, it shames the perverse and the lustful. His unwavering honesty shames the liar and the manipulator. His gentleness and meekness and kindness shames the violent and the oppressor. His effort, his passion, his drive, his determination shames the slothful and the lazy and the complacent. His death, his sacrifice, it shames the prideful and the selfish and the self-centered. Jesus creates tension for every single human being that walks the earth. And some people don't like him in part because he won't leave them alone. He won't let any of us stay the way we are. I'm 45. I have done this my whole life. I do not remember what it was like to not have Jesus, because I can't remember anything before I was 5 years old. And I can tell you, in all of these years of experience, a week doesn't go by where He doesn't create a pressure point in me, because I get a look at His perfection and say, there's something in me that's still got to evolve in His direction. He puts tension on everyone. He holds all accountable. And the truth is, if the version of Jesus we worship doesn't confront us, if He doesn't occasionally make us uncomfortable, if the Jesus we worship doesn't challenge some of our long-held ideas and thoughts and some of our preferences, then it's possible we don't know Jesus very well, and maybe even worse, we have fashioned an idol in the form of Jesus, and it's not really Him at all. Jesus is not a weapon in our culture wars. He is not a pawn in our political strategy. He's not a partner in our personal preferences. He can't be hijacked by our social agendas. Jesus holds all humanity accountable in His radiant perfection. And all of us have to be careful to not use Him and abuse Him. So the trap. We're just kind of working our way through the text. The trap wasn't that complicated to explain, but you could see the conundrum they were trying to put Jesus in. The trap is that in the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, as well as in the book of Leviticus, there were laws under that old covenant that said if someone was caught in adultery, they were to be killed. So these laws that were being cited by the Pharisees were from Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and they were saying, look, you're a teacher, you're a rabbi, you know all of this. You know the rules. You know the rules. She has broken the rules. The rule book says this is what should happen to her. But they also were living in a Roman society that would not permit them to exact that kind of punishment. And so if Jesus says stone her, He is now breaking the law of Rome. And if He says don't, they can accuse Him of not being a man of holiness and righteousness. They're trying to get Him stuck. And then we find ourselves in the same pressure point that I think we find ourselves in a lot. The rules of society versus the rules of religion. I mean, I think it's interesting that we find ourselves constantly surrounded by what society says we as the church have to do, what we're allowed to say and what we're allowed to think, how we're allowed to address issues, versus what some within our own family say we have to do. I don't know about you, but I get tired of people telling me what I have to do. This is what you have to say. This is how you have to handle this. Pick a side, and I've said it before, the only side I'm picking is Jesus' side. That's the only side I'm picking. But the ploy angers me the most because the Pharisees didn't care about justice or holiness, because the same law that they cited in Deuteronomy and Leviticus said that the man had to be brought to. They conveniently left him out. They just brought her. So they didn't care about justice and righteousness. They didn't care about what was honorable and what was right. They just had an agenda. Where was the man? I don't think this was about gender bias. I think this was more about the incongruence of anyone who is interested in throwing stones. It seems like folks who are all in on throwing stones usually don't care a whole lot about the details. Like people that are prone to pick up a rock don't really care how the details play out. They just are ready to throw. So I think it was just another issue where these men had an agenda, they had an ideology, they had a way of thinking, and they were unrelenting and unwavering in it. But it should be noted that she was an adulterer, but she had to stand before Jesus on her own. It took two to create the act of sin, but it was her alone in the middle of the crowd with Jesus. She didn't get to point to the other person and say, what about them? She didn't get to start blaming someone else for what she had done. She didn't have the privilege of saying, well, they led me into this, or this is what they did, and this is how they acted, and these are all the things they did wrong to me. So, I did the wrong, and so I'm justified in doing my wrong because of all. No, none of us get the privilege of pointing at everybody else. We all have to stand before Jesus. And a lot of times we step into sin because of our engagement with other people that pressure us, other people that drag us into mess, other people that provoke us and stir us. But when it's all said and done, we don't get to point to the other side of the aisle and say, well, what about them? No. I'm standing in front of Jesus on my own. It doesn't matter what they did, it's me and him. I think in the church we do have to be careful in this hostile environment we find ourselves in society right now, with a lot of accusational rhetoric and a lot of infighting, to make sure that we don't justify our sin by pointing at what everybody else is doing. We're not going to be that church that says, well, they're doing that, so we're going to do this. No. We are going to stand with Jesus, and we're going to take our cues from him. We're going to conduct ourselves in a way that's honorable to him. The reason the ploy angers me isn't just that they really didn't care about justice. It's not that they were incongruent. What really angers me is they have this woman who has sinned, and they're leveraging her sin, her dysfunction, her shame, her guilt, her struggle, her brokenness, her embarrassment, her worst moment. They are leveraging all of that to make a point. This is a different kind of message than I usually preach, but I feel like there's a bit of a prophetic layer on it. I just want to speak to something in the world around us. There are a lot of people who are in sin. They're living with the consequences of it, and they have been stuck in the middle of crowds that are trying to use their brokenness for their own agenda. There are a couple of groups that come to mind. One of them is the LGBTQ community, the transgender community. I have very strong opinions when it comes to our God-given identity and our God-given sexuality. I have very strong opinions. I've already said homosexuality, I believe, without a doubt, Scriptures communicate it clearly, is sin. But I hate that in the midst of all of our culture wars, we forget that there are some broken people standing in the middle of the crowd. They are not fodder for our fighting. They are not a weapon in our hand. They're a heart that's broken. The same, and that's why I love that today we had Save One here, because another is that group that has had abortions, and we're fighting over this thing, and I'm 100% in the fight of I want abortion to end in our nation, because I believe it is a blight on our country. But we have to be careful, because there are men and women standing in the circle in the middle of the crowd who are broken, who are hurting, who are distressed. They're not a weapon in our hands. They're not a point to be made. And it bothers me that in this text, these people who seem to be calling for holiness and righteousness have no interest in the brokenness of a person. They have no concern for just how much of a mess this woman is in the middle of. What about the woman? What about the people caught in the middle? And there's some of us in the room that we find ourselves in the middle of having been caught recently. There are some of us that have some patterns in our life we hope never get caught. We don't want them. We don't like them. We hope that they don't ever get exposed to the light of day. And there are others of us that have been abused. We've been used for other people's agenda. But I love what happens in the text, verses 6 through 7. I want to read them again. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. Verse 7, they kept demanding an answer. So he stood up again and said, I love this because it indicates that Jesus was going to move at his own pace. They wanted him to answer a question. They made an accusation. They wanted an answer. They demanded an answer. And Jesus just like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do when I'm going to do it. And y'all don't really get to tell me when I'm going to do it or what I'm going to do. You don't control the situation. So they kept demanding. They wanted some kind of response. And so you can almost just see them slowly standing. Just making them wait that extra second. I'm not dancing to your song. You don't get to dictate the terms to me. I'm not playing the game the way you want me to play the game. You aren't going to control me emotionally. You're not going to manipulate me. You're not going to force me to say this or do that. And I just want to say that I believe the people of Cornerstone are called to a similar strength. We don't dance to the song of this world. We don't dance to the song of the political arena. We don't dance to the song of social media. We don't dance to the song that society wants us to dance to. We don't go at the pace or the timing. We don't say what everybody else wants us to say and do what everybody else wants us to do the way everybody wants us to say it and do it. No, like Jesus, we are in the middle of all of this chaos. And we are on his pace, and we are on his time, and we are at his word, and we will respond the way he wants us to respond, and we won't get caught up in the swirl of everything around us. So what did he do? What did he say? He stood up and again said, all right, but let the one who's never sinned throw the first stone. Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. I love that he, in essence, positions everybody in a place of humility. Everybody wanting to throw a rock. Do we really need to have a conversation about what you've done? Okay, everybody wanting to accuse. Do we really need to talk about the way you've behaved? Nobody really knows what Jesus wrote in the dust. The text says he stooped down. We can assume with a finger, and he wrote something. I mean, there's been a lot of poetic license taken. There's been a lot of artistic speculation. You know, maybe he wrote the sins of the other people. Maybe he wrote some kind of note to the woman of like, I got you, don't worry. A lot of people have speculated what he wrote. I've only really found one theory that feels like it might be it, but I don't even know for certain, but it's an interesting theory. We know that he was in the temple area, and so the ground would have been paved stone. And just like any other paved area, likely had dust on the paved stone. And notice that Jesus stooped, and we assume wrote with his finger. Well, there is a moment in the Old Testament on Mount Sinai when Moses was in the mountain. And God came to Moses, and the Bible tells us that the Lord on stone tablets with his finger wrote the 10 Commandments, right? Now, interestingly, Moses comes down from the mountain, sees the people worshiping the golden calf. He breaks the 10 Commandments. So he has to go back up the mountain. And he goes back up the mountain, and God, a second time, with his finger, writes in stone tablets the law. Now, the theory would be this: Jesus, the first time, stooped down in stone and with his finger, as God on earth, wrote the law, the 10 Commandments. He stood up, and like God the Father did the second time on the mountain, he went down again. And the text tells us he, for a second time, stooped down and with his finger, we believe, wrote in the dust. So it's a very good possibility that what Jesus was writing in that moment was the law, the 10 Commandments that they were in essence citing. And he was letting them know, I know the rules. If the worship team will come. I know the law. But the deal with the law is the law doesn't save us. The law exposes our sin. The New Testament helps us understand that the whole point of the law was so that we had no doubt in our minds that we needed saving and we couldn't do it ourselves because we've all broke the law. The law was an accusation against humanity. Very much the way these Pharisees were accusing this woman, the law has accused all of humanity. But here the Son of God has come, and the Bible says that Jesus came to fulfill the law. In essence, what does that mean? If she was supposed to be stoned to death, he came and he died on a cross. He suffered the consequence of her sin. He fulfilled the law. There was no need for a single rock because he was about to come and be high perched on a rock called Golgotha. And he was going to stand in the place of humanity. He was going to fulfill the law. He was going to remove the accusation of the law. He came to remove the accusation of the law and to replace it with a merciful path toward holiness. I really like the way the New Living Translation says it. It uses two different words. Where are your accusers? Where are the ones who condemn you? You know, there is an accuser that still roams the earth. Satan's called the accuser of the brethren. He's making accusations against people. There are some believers in this room that you live under the whisper of Satan's accusation constantly. You're not good enough. That thing you did will always haunt you. That mistake you made will always stay with you. That failure, your life will never be what God intended because of that failure. You're on an alternate course now. For others, that thing that you're trying to break free from, the voice of the accuser says, you'll always fall short. God can't receive you. God can't bless you. God can't love you. And I love that Jesus basically says to the woman, hey, your accusers are gone. I have come to silence the accuser. I want to say to some believers in the room who hear that sense of shame and guilt that always knocks on the door of your heart saying you're not good enough, you'll never measure up, you're a failure, you're a fraud. Some of us in this room live under the weight of I'm not doing enough. Some of us are consumed with the I can do better. I should be doing better. I should have that figured out. Just overwhelmed by it. Your spouse might not even know that you wrestle with that. There's some men that lay in bed at night and the accuser of the brethren comes and sits by the bed and begins to make accusations against your life. Some of you women, you're going through your day. Everybody on the outside feels like you're a great mom, you're a great wife, you serve in the church, but there is this silent accusation that always rings out. Remember when you did this? Remember when you said that? Oh, you blew it earlier today. It just doesn't seem to stop. And I just want you to know that Jesus came to silence the accusation. He came to tell you that's not who you are. That thing that makes you feel diminished, that voice that makes you feel insignificant, that voice that makes it feel like you have miles to go, that's not the voice of the Holy Spirit. That's the accuser saying you deserve less than what Jesus has won for you. But I'm here today to say, like Jesus said to the woman, where is your accuser? Where are those who would condemn you? She said, they're gone. And he said, neither do I accuse you. I don't accuse you. Now, what he also says, and I think some of us might be afraid here that I'll just get a little too loose on sin, but I love the tension of this moment. He says, hey, I don't accuse you. Go and sin no more. Like both of those ideas, both of them, mercy and holiness, purity and grace. I can redeem what's been lost, but I'm not going to let you stay the same. All of that packed in this moment. You'll be different from this point on. You'll be different after this exchange. That thing that you used to be is no more. Now there's folks in the room that I want you to hear. Whatever you've done, wherever you've been, whatever consequences you're living in, whatever the fallout of your decision making, there is Jesus standing in the middle of it all with you today. And I think it's beautiful that he deals with the Pharisees, and he doesn't talk to her until the end, but finally he addresses her. She knows he just saved her life. She knows he just did something nobody else was willing to do for her. And I want you to hear this, wherever you are, when it comes to your distance from God or your proximity to Him, He's standing right there with you saying, I'll change you. I'll make you different. I'll clean you up. I'll redeem what you've lost. I'll restore what you've surrendered. I'll fix what you broke.